All right, we're gonna call,
I was super
we're
positive.
gonna call this
What
meeting
if
to
while I was
order.
there? So you have a framework.
Welcome to the June Homeless Solutions Advisory Council meeting.
Gosh.
We have, well, first item on the agenda is public comment. Do we have any guests in the room or online?
No
I would
comments.
like to provide.
None from the forum online.
Okay. Well, then we will move on to staff updates with Jess and Emily.
Thank you, Co-Chair Han and Marshall, Co-Chairs Han and Marshall. Happy June, everybody.
The kids.
I mean, where else to start but our wonderful new members, Jason and Bob. Welcome aboard. We're so grateful and excited to have you both. Jason, I've known you for a long time. Jason Green, everyone. I'm happy to introduce you to, though you've probably met Jason too if you've been around the work of homeless system research and data analytics. I've always appreciated how your advocacy for the work of homeless services and advancing good programmatic solutions to this crisis is so data driven and research backed, so that the impassioned advocates who maybe are sitting around the table have like real juicy nuggets to back up our strong feels. So we're excited to have that expertise of yours here at our table. And we know you've been a part of the Washington County family for a very long time, but now you are officially a part of this team, and we're really grateful to have you. So welcome aboard.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Great. And then Bob Grover, we see you at home. We are also happy to have you aboard. You've also been a great champion of this work and leader here in Washington County for many years. Before I ever began my work in Washington County, I know that you were organizing and advocating for the vision of a future hope center, a vision that Portland had been working on, and that you and many of your colleagues in community driven kind of advocacy had been working towards. And it's really cool how you've been able to help bring that vision into fruition many years later. It's perhaps not exactly as it was first envisioned, but how much the system has grown, and knowing that we're going to have a transition housing program with Helping Hands, helping people through the recovery journey, and knowing that that vision really started with your leadership and work. So welcome to this team, and you've been here for so long already. Now we're just happy to have you officially a part of this table.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm excited to serve. The issue, it affects everybody, but in my line of business as a landscape contractor working for virtually all of the commercial property manager companies and maintaining a number of buildings in downtown Portland, but also throughout the metro area, it's been an issue for that industry. And the rest of the group, I got quite involved with the Helping Hands organization when they transformed the Bybee Lakes facility into a homeless service recovery center, and was so inspired by that. Yeah, tried to put together a group to do something similar out here, and it's challenging, as I know with the Cornell Road facility, is to find the right location. And we kind of gave up on that, and really excited that you came up with that. Easier for you to fight through that battle in the neighborhood than our did, and great that Helping Hands is going to be managing that facility. So it took longer than we'd hoped it, and more complicated, but very excited to also stay involved and figure out how we can continue to help and transition more of that population into self-supporting members of our society.
That's so great. Well, we were thrilled to have both your applications to join our Solutions Council advisory work. And both of your perspectives are going to be great adds to this table, where we continue to envision the future we are trying to bring about through the resources we have to respond to the community needs around homelessness. So thank you both for being here, and welcome aboard. I think with that, I turn it back over to Nadia or Emily.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna offer a couple updates about community engagement work for two new facilities we are bringing to fruition. The first is the Central County Safe Rest Village. We officially have a final good neighbor agreement. And we also facilitated a community process to select a new and permanent name for that location. So we're gonna start socializing the name Next Step Community. Please use it in your circles, and we're just really excited to have a community-driven name selection process that we will also bring to Cornell Road. So stay tuned for that. The update with Cornell Road is we just had another community meeting last night. Saw a few faces in that space. Thank you so much for joining us. And you know, as Bob alluded to, that has been a contentious, at times really challenging community engagement process. But I feel like we've covered a lot of ground with neighbors, and we're really starting to see that trust building happening in real time, and that is such a lovely thing to see. So we have one more community meeting for Cornell Road Recovery scheduled for August, and yes, we will also be renaming that building because Cornell Road Recovery, it doesn't roll off the tongue. So yeah, if you have any ideas, let us know.
Washington County Hope Center.
Back to me? Okay. So the last bullet item here is when I asked team to just make sure we got into our talking points. It's really foreshadowing some work in front of us as a solutions council. One of your most important roles is helping advise how we use our resources to meet our community need. And Washington County is a very strong fiscal steward of resources. We've been conservative in the way we've been managing our resources, forecasting expenditures, forecasting revenues, and being cautious to overcommit ourselves from such that we would never have to hopefully lose resources for people who were in the middle of any of our programs. And that's really complicated work to do from year to year when we have very different funding sources. SHS is an income-driven two-set of tax measures that are very volatile to economic conditions. The state budget is an every 2-year big advocacy haul, and we never quite know how it's going to end up. And then, of course, federal resources, as you know, are at risk and changing as we speak. So taking all of those revenue sources and then building this system of care over the last few years and trying to learn more and more about our expenditure rates has been an ongoing financial challenge or opportunity to understand what it costs to maintain the system of care that we've built. So what I'm getting to here is because of that strong fiscal stewardship and being very intentional to manage resources to protect and serve the community we are needing to serve, we are anticipating actually a higher than expected end fund balance at the end of this fiscal year, which presents an opportunity for us to respond to more of the unmet need than we have not yet been able to respond to here in Washington County. Most of this resource, most of that unfunded balance will be limited to one-time funding. So as you all know, one-time funding is different than ongoing resource. But we also think that some might be able to pay for ongoing services such that we could expand some capacity where we can tailor our resources to meet specific unmet needs in our system. So I've asked Katie and her team to begin doing some programmatic research with our data and evaluation team to understand where those gaps are in our system and start to bring some information forward to the Solutions Council so we can begin this conversation with you all. And so I wanted to just give you that heads up. So you're anticipating this important work, probably starting in August and continuing through the actual fiscal year. It ends obviously July 1st, but it takes 2 additional months to close out the fiscal year for a couple of reasons in county finances. One of which is we actually don't receive the final check from SHS for the fiscal year until August 15th. So we won't know the end fund balance for some time, but we should begin planning for this opportunity and this responsibility to respond to community needs. So we'll be sharing more information to prepare you for that conversation in August, and look for some reading materials ahead of that meeting so that you can come and prepare for the discussion. Any questions? I don't wanna make that murkier.
Better news than I'm in every other news.
Yeah.
So, awesome.
Yeah.
It's a good problem to have
Yeah.
and we need to be very responsible and responsive with the resources, yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Emily, and welcome, Bob. Welcome, Jason. It was really incredible reading about the extensive work you have done in the space beforehand, before this. So we're really excited to have you on this amazing council. So I know I love it. Okay, next up, we'll move on to committee updates. Adam, do you have any procurement committee?
Yep, the procurement committee has set a time where we'll be reviewing applications. Applications are due next week. So yeah, committee is organized and ready to review and then provide feedback to Katie and team. Did I hit my talking points? All right,
Spot on.
great.
Thank you. Next up, Hack, Nadia.
So HAC reviewed and submitted the budget to HBOD, which passed budget and budget policy. They're gonna meet again next week. I think that will be the 25th. Yeah, I'm doing that, sorry.
Nadia, for new members, will you describe what HAC is?
Yes, so the Housing Advisory Committee is under the Housing Authority of Washington County. So our department has the DHS side and the HAWC side, as we call it. The Housing Advisory Committee reviews a lot of the other end of the other side of the house, we call it sometimes. All the things related to housing and shelters and the new contracts and projects and building. And the budget for the Housing Authority is a big item that they go through, and they've been going through for pretty much the last few months. Their review is then submitted to the HBOD, which is the Housing Authority Board of Directors, which is made up of the Board of Commissioners, plus 2 members at large, including our resident participants. So we have 1 director who is from the resident programs. And that's the final authority on all of the decisions regarding the Housing Authority. Oh, makes sense. Okay. And then we have
Next up, Abel, McKinney Vento update. Be able to step away.
we can ask them to email.
Okay. Abel, if you can hear us, if you want to just email the group your updates. Or if you get back on, because we'll bounce it over to Zoe with RPOC. I know we're gonna discuss RPOC. But Zoe, do you have anything to add beyond what we're gonna discuss today?
Because the meeting the meeting that happened last week was around those discussions of the strategies that Jess is going to bring later. And it will help us a lot. It will help me to also bring information into the July meeting when we will continue to discuss this investment fund. So, yeah, I don't think so.
And for new members, the RPOC is a new Metro advisory body, and I'm blanking on what the acronym stands for.
Regional Policy
Thank you.
Oversight Committee.
Yes. So a new kind of guiding space around supportive housing services specifically that was recently stood up to replace a couple of older Metro advisory bodies and provide that regional coordination. Jess, you could probably speak to more there as well.
We'll get into it.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll try Abel again. Is his camera on? And then if not, doesn't look like his camera's on. Okay. And then Kim or anyone else, does anyone else have any council updates online or in the room? Okay. See nodding heads. Okay. We will now move on to the birthday girl, Katie Gentry. I'm sorry.
I did not grab it.
She has an update on us. Happy birthday. For the screening process for shelter and transitional housing. It was in the notes.
We can go to the next slide. So, if you, haven't heard, we went to the board, about 2 weeks ago now, after many engagement conversations with, the launch of both our Next Step Community and the Cornell Road Recovery Project, and had a lot of questions from community members about specifically sex offenders and violent criminal history in our shelters and transitional housing. And so we got direction from our board to do a ton of research, and Jess and I and many others have been working across Washington County to recommend potential options to our board as of 2 weeks ago. And so 2 weeks ago, we took a set of recommendations to our board to really follow what is in alignment with state law, which, if you don't know, it's like really complicated. And so state law currently says for level 3 sex offenders and offenders who are sex offenders who are on probation or parole, that they cannot be where kids congregate. So we went through a lot of research and understanding to better understand where participants should and should not be referred to, and where they can reside. And we are working through now implementation of those changes based on board direction. So the board ultimately adopted 1,000 feet from the closest childcare center or school facility based on when the property was initiated. So 1,000 feet is really in alignment with community corrections standards. So they often defer to 1,000 feet when they are reviewing folks that are on probation or parole. And that is the choice that our board also decided to move forward. So it would be any shelter where kids are. So our family shelters where there are folks under 18, and then any of our shelters within 1,000 feet. So next slide. What is the background behind this and why was it? We needed clarity specifically around the shelters that were going to be impacted by this, and really wanted to get further clarity around following state law. And so we also balance that though with, we have a low barrier system. We want to be able to serve people in as many places as possible. And so we worked across the county, corrections, sheriff's office. We even contacted the state, we contacted our other partners in this space to really understand what other folks are doing, and really came forward with, I think Jess did a really great job presenting up to our board kind of what were the different options. And if you're interested, would really recommend checking out that June 9th work session, kind of all of the different considerations and questions that our board asked of the presenters.
Am I allowed to? I don't feel like I'm chair today. I would agree with you, Jess did a fantastic job. And one of the things that you spoke about was the outreach to like our county partners and how they do things. Could you speak more into that for educational purposes here?
Sure. I mean, in doing this research to understand what our best practices, what are any practices, and what are requirements when it comes to screening out or not people with certain criminal convictions or residency restrictions. We didn't find that in either of our, we didn't find any county colleagues who have a county-wide procedural process. What we found often was that the determination was left to operators. So there were different decisions being made in the counties. And in sometimes decisions that led to more screening than might have been desired by the county administrator. So it was hard to it was a challenging assignment to be given, and also in the end, it might create more clarity for all of our providers in ways in which that clarity doesn't exist in other counties. Did I answer your question?
You answered it perfectly.
Okay.
We'll go to the next slide. So probably your next question is, who does this impact? So we have 7 shelters that Washington County funds that this will impact. Our 4 family shelters and youth shelter, and then 3 additional shelters. Our non-congregate bridge shelter here in Hillsborough, our Cornell Road project that will be opening this fall, and then our Transcending Hope project in Hillsborough that will be opening probably late 2027. This will impact folks that are level 3 sex offenders and people who are under probation and parole, except for if folks are, we will be reaching out to probation and parole to say, is this a safe place for them to live? So if probation and parole determine that this is actually a suitable location for that participant, then this restriction does not apply. So I would say I am optimistic about the coordination that we're going to be having moving forward and kind of what some next steps really look like. And so with that, I'll go to the next slide to really be kind of bring this to you on, providing some information, recognizing what are the alternatives for people screened out of transitional housing and our medical respite programs. What does partnership look like between community corrections and our sheriff's office with us? And kind of ask you all, do you have risks or challenges that you think we will have around implementation? This will go into effect September 1st. So staff are working to apply that implementation direction from our board over the next 2 months. We're developing a project plan, how we're going to work with corrections in the sheriff's office to get this information on a regular basis, and then start making referrals. All of this screening will go through Washington County, so the agency themselves that is receiving the referral will not have to be doing this referral. Once we send the referral off, that will have already happened prior to them accepting the referral. And we're really looking through like what are options for folks that could not participate in these programs, and what are some different policy options, and how do we manage kind of like making sure that we still have non-congregate spaces available for folks and alternative shelter options for folks. So I'll pause, see if folks have first any questions or any thoughts on any of these conversations.
Do you have any idea if folks who are currently in some of those like settings would be displaced by when this rule goes live?
As far as we know, when we last did a data comparison, specifically with level 3 sex offenders, we did not have anybody that was impacted. However, we have not yet done the probation and parole comparison yet. So we're going to start working through that, doing some data testing, moving folks as we identify them before September 1st, and then going into effect September 1st for it.
So it would be, the impact would be minimal is what you're suspecting from the current census. Yeah.
The biggest impact that we anticipate potentially is our non-congregate shelter with Hillsborough. It's the one project that is open right now that this is now impacting. Our family providers right now, it's really unlikely that somebody has possession of their 18-year-old and under while this being the case. And so our family providers have not really expressed any concerns.
Thank you.
All right, any more questions? Anyone online have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I can find my hand. So, Katie, you said that because at phase 1 we don't ask for any criminal history, and we will not have, or the participant probably also will not know what level and if they are where they are, right? So you said that Community Connect will do the match, and then Washington County will do the research with Correction Department to see what restrictions they are on and if they are able to be matched.
So
okay.
This will only apply to shelter and transitional housing assessments. It won't apply to the phase 1 because this will not impact any of our housing programs. And then Washington County is taking on kind of the process for comparing with community corrections, doing all of that data comparison.
But when people call Community Connect, they are asked if they want to stay in shelter and
Yep, so this will happen at the point of referral to a shelter, not at the place of somebody being interested in shelter. So when folks are getting assessed for shelter, we will just be gathering all of that information, but prior to referral to whatever shelter they're getting referred to is when that screening.
Right.
Because we also don't want to over screen folks.
Right.
We do not have the capacity to screen all the people on our shelter wait list. We want to do it at the point of referral.
Right. Right. And do we know how many people in Washington County can be like? Do we have data of how many people on that level are homeless, for example, from corrections?
We don't yet know from corrections. We have done some data comparisons with the sheriff's office already. But the corrections data, we don't have a good understanding. And even the data that was like sheriff's office collected was their data that said this person is experiencing homelessness was much different than our data. So we're kind of waiting to see the data comparisons to see how many folks this will actually incorporate, because we had much different numbers. We had a lot lower number than the sheriff's office did when it came to level 3 sex offenders.
All right. Thank you.
And this is not data we put into the memos, but I think it's fine for us to share with our Solutions Council. There are about 2,000 registered sex offenders in Washington County, about 700 individuals under community corrections, about 200 level 3.
115.
Thank you. 115 are level 3. These are all overlapping. Not, don't add them all up, but 115 would be on the public registry. And 700 would be having a corrections office support their transition into community. And then the sheriff's data had 77, is that right, Katie, or 72?
72 experiencing homelessness according to their data, and our data comparison was much less.
Yeah. So that just helps you have a sense of the number of individuals that our system would then be working to support with other resources. And those resources could be including the shelters that are not highlighted, but also other resources like the transition center that the sheriff's department operates.
What about the medical shelter? I imagine that would be one of the trickiest places to find a replacement for.
Yes, so thanks for asking that, Rachel. I also see your hand, so we'll come to you in a second. Our medical respite has been operating out of the Hillsborough Bridge Shelter, and there is the intention to transition it to our Cornell Road project when that project opens. Staff actually are right now working through kind of some of those referral challenges of not only sex offenders, but also prescription narcotics, so folks who are in our medical respite, because that is not going to be an option at Cornell Road. So how are we navigating that? So they are actually coming forward with a policy recommendation in 2 weeks to me as to how we're going to navigate it and what does that look like. And then we will go to our medical respite partner, Virginia Garcia, to have further conversations. The other thing that we have been brainstorming and are going to come forward with a recommendation is if somebody needs non-congregate shelter, what would be the scenario where somebody is a pod or a semi-congregate pod is not the right situation for them? And is there ever a case where that is the situation? Because now our one non-congregate shelter is going to be within this restriction. I think staff have done a great job like brainstorming and problem solving through this and kind of bringing up some of the challenges that have come.
Oh, perfect. That was Rachel's question. Okay.
What's the probation and parole? Like, I don't understand that piece. What does that mean?
Yeah, state law says that the restriction around where kids congregate applies to both level 3 sex offenders and sex offenders on probation or parole.
So 1, 2s.
Could be still on probation or parole and be subject to this same residency restriction. Our understanding, and I might tap you in here, Jess, is that probation and parole is evaluating what is in their individual stipulation agreement to determine whether or not this is a safe place for them to stay or not.
So the level threes, according to state law, have a residency restriction about living, about being where in the premises where kids are. But the state law says also that county corrections offices should create their own residency restrictions for sex offenders under their supervision, according to their own procedural, best practices and guidance and expertise. And so that's why we consulted our corrections office to learn what are their established practices, so that our procedures will adhere to their practices for those under their supervision, and then state law for those, the others that are just under level 3 but not under supervision. So I know Katie has said this, but I'll say it again. The intention here is to affirm what residency restrictions already exist and make sure that those residency restrictions aren't being overlooked when we refer someone to one of our shelters where they would apply.
But your question brought up, so you're saying parole and probation now affects level 1 and 2?
Correct. So you
But-
could have someone who, well, okay, yeah,
No, go with it.
no, I feel like I probably shouldn't.
So
Okay, so
somebody-
you're gonna have someone who is a level 1 sex offender who could have done something that is fairly a low level crime, but in the court's eyes is a level 1 sex offender who can now not get the transition, the help, the housing.
Right.
At any of these locations, nor can they get the help me.
Yes, thank you for asking this question. We want to be as clear as possible.
Thank you.
Our screening isn't, are they under your supervision? Our screening is, are they under supervision, and are there any residency restrictions that you have created while they're under their supervision? So it doesn't mean all 700 individuals will be precluded from these facilities.
Right.
It's just that we have to check their list and
Okay.
ask, are they under your supervision? And then if yes,
Okay.
would they be able to live here? According to corrections.
Okay.
Based on like whatever crime like the details of whatever they were,
My understanding is the language is residency restrictions.
yeah.
So what are the residency restrictions that correction is using for this individual? Some individuals won't have any residency restrictions.
Right.
Yeah,
And some will.
yeah,
The residency restriction might be you can't live with your family members,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And their family members aren't in our shelter, so that doesn't apply to our
Right,
shelter.
right.
But the restriction could be you can't live within 1,000 feet of where kids congregate, and then that would apply.
okay.
So we're not making the determination about what are the residency restrictions. We're asking if there are any that would
Yeah.
preclude them from living in our facilities.
Gotcha. Rachel?
Thank you. I just remember from past lives, the additional challenges for finding strategies for folks who were sex offenders, but also developmentally delayed. And I'm wondering if we have as we're thinking about where folks are going to be going, but do we have other strategies around like what people's needs are going to be in those particular places where they're allowed to be? It was really hard to find placements for people who are developmentally delayed and who are sex offenders. It's like almost impossible sometimes.
I don't have a great answer for you, Rachel, but thank you for the flag. And as we continue to kind of like unpeel this layers, we'll definitely come back to you and this group about kind of how we are addressing specifically that. I will say one of the things that we've already started working closer with probation and parole on is places where folks can live and what does that look like, and specifically like on the housing side, I've already seen some strides happen, and so excited to continue this partnership with them and really start to leverage the resources that they use and the resources we use, and how do we find this like middle ground that is better for sex offenders overarchingly.
We have questions on the screen. Oh, and Abel wants to provide, yeah.
regarding this topic, it just reminds me, I had a situation early on this school year. I think it was like late October or November, where we had a family whose student qualified for our services, where they had been, it was student and dad, and both of them ended up getting kicked out of a shelter because dad had been convicted of statutory back when he was a teen, and so I'm trying to think of like what what additional risks around that implementation for that type of demographic. Like if
So
they have children, like the addition of like having children too.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Adele. So this is where I think that there's an opportunity for this policy to help reduce restrictions, because I think there have been times in the past where any kind of sex offense was being screened out, and we're only looking to level 3 in the public database and to corrections. So that offense hopefully is not a level 3, and if it was so old, probably that person would not be under corrections any longer. And then a third element here is another learning, and Katie, you might help with this, that through the partnership with the sheriff's office, there's been some learning around how to help individuals reduce their level, because sometimes the level is now no longer relevant or is outdated, and there are procedures to work through with law enforcement to help reduce that level so that they can come off of the registry essentially.
Thank
So
you.
Val, I hope that, oh yeah, you're welcome. I hope that it's a really helpful example. And again, the goal here is that there are no restrictions being created unless there are restrictions in place for the safety of the community.
Okay, thank you all. And Abel, we'll have you do your update towards the end if we have time. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. Okay, up next.
Did we answer these questions?
What questions? Oh, these questions.
Yeah.
The 3 questions.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I think we have some good direction, and you all ask good questions for us to come back to you all. And as we start to work through implementation, we'll continue to keep you informed.
So our alternatives are just the other shelters?
We're working through kind of like what are, if somebody needs non-congregate, like what are potential proposals for that to move forward to.
Okay. But if somebody needs recovery housing, they're level 3.
That is also what staff is assigned to while I'm on vacation.
All right, thank you, Katie. And it looks like you will be up again. We'll move on to the emergency food and shelter program allocations.
We'll go to the next slide. So quick overview, what is EFSP? It's the Emergency Food and Shelter Program. It's a federal dollars allocated through the HHS office and FEMA. They are specifically allocated locally for food and shelter, and there is local boards that establish these funding priorities and review applications. Typically it's in partnership with United Way. So they are the ones who kind of like bring us together to do these local boards. Our local board is kind of the Tri-County area to get funding, and we are bringing this to you all. And there was a memo included in your packet about establishing what eligible priorities you all would like to fund and at what percentage. The eligible priorities are food, so food bank, things like that, either pre-made meals or kind of bulk food. Off-site lodging, so that would be motel or hotel, one night to 7-night stays. Rent or mortgage payments, this is up to 90 days of rent or mortgage payments, similar to how we fund eviction prevention. And then shelter, so that would be an ongoing shelter cost. You can go to the next slide. In the past, the last time we got this, which it is not semi-regular, was in 2024, and we got $219,000. The priorities at the time were 20% food and 80% rent and mortgage payments, and you can see kind of those past awards The process for doing this is today, we're going to ask you all to vote on priorities, and we will take that back to our local board group. And then they will be putting out an application and folks can apply at that time. We do not know when that will happen. It's kind of a stop start. So like think more like broadly what is needed in our community and less like this will be live July 1 and funding will be available. So that's something to know is like kind of what is the overarching need in the community, not necessarily like we have a timeline for rolling out this funding. So with that, I am going to go to our next slide and ask you all to have a discussion and think about any considerations that we should be making when reviewing applications, but what percentage of funds do you want to allocate to each of those 4 categories? As a reminder, 20% food, 80% rent and mortgage payments last year. You can stay with those same priorities or change them. And then we need a motion to move forward. Any recommendations that you all are considering?
Katie, can I ask you to add a little bit, one question that comes up for me is it's $200,000, which, well, it's not a lot of money. And is it very administratively burdensome and would there be consideration for focusing on one priority rather than distributing support priorities? Do you have any context there to add?
We don't have a lot of context. It is a direct contract through United Way. Washington County is not super involved in the contracting. So we've not had it described as overly burdensome, but they do work directly with the local board to oversee the funding.
Thank you.
Okay, so discussion on the allocation.
This is Bob Grover. My wife volunteers at St. Matthew, St. Vincent de Paul in Hillsborough, and she helps coordinate their rent and utility assistance. She's also aware that Community Action does. So, there's a great need out there for rent and utility assistance. They also, St. Vincent de Paul also has a food pantry, and I know there's a variety over there, but it seems like just from my Hillsborough related, there's way short of the ability to support rent and utility coverage for people. It seems like a greater issue than food at this point. And I think it seems like there's a lot of other food related supportive programs out there. So I would think more of it should go to rent and utility assistance stuff.
Thank you, Bob.
Have you heard back from providers about a specific gap in any one area? I know that many more people dropped off SNAP in Oregon than we expected recently. So I wonder if you've gotten any input on that or anything else. It seems to be a bigger gap than usual.
We have not specifically heard directly. Similarly, I would say food and eviction prevent rent or mortgage payments are the things we hear most consistently in our community as needs. Zoe?
I will be curious to know from, for example, the award before, like how was the reach and the administrative burden as is that federal program, and from previous experience, it is very administrative burdened, and I feel like we should also see what's already there on rent and eviction prevention, and then if there's between the two, like if there is a gap. We know SNAP and TANF have been severely impacted. A lot of our communities, BIPOC communities, are receiving less or none on those. Our food pantries are struggling. In summer, it's kids are out of school, and meal for shelters, for example, should be another. Those who provide meals will be another idea. That's just my thinking. That right now food is a huge issue for families because of the cuts, federal cuts, state cuts on SNAP and TANF.
I think about kind of what Zoe's saying, and then knowing that right now that folks who are on Medicaid, who are also undocumented folks, are going to have their Medicaid shifted, and many of them are going to fall off starting January 1st, 2027. And I think about the impact that right now that the folks have had, or that population has experienced, and they're a part of our community. I think instead of like looking at a percentage going to one of these things, I would argue more for a population-based support. If we've got any extra money, I suspect that's a population that right now is needing it a lot more than a lot of other places, and they can't, and restricted funds are having a much tougher time going to those who are undocumented neighbors. And so for me, that would be more of a priority than any of the like popular like specific categories up there.
But these are what are eligible.
Yep.
So under the guide, yeah.
Sorry.
No, really good point.
What's
And also,
And
yeah.
take that into consideration
Completely wrong.
if it is eligible under this funding source
Sure.
when we are reviewing applications. But what we are truly looking for is
Is the
the breakdown
percentage.
of
Okay.
percentage between those
Got it.
4 eligible categories, because we will only accept applications under the eligible categories that you all prioritize.
So when is this funding good? The timeline?
We don't know.
Oh,
And
excellent.
they have yet to find out. So typically it is good for 1 year from the time that awards happen.
Okay.
But we didn't even expect to have this funding available again this year.
Okay, and then I don't know who could answer this. I don't know if you, the past awards that you highlighted.
Yeah.
Really interesting numbers. You know, one entity got a majority of the funds and the others, how does that work? How does that process?
So that was based on application review. No Washington County folks who were participating in that are still here. So we do
Okay.
not have
We don't know. Okay.
understanding, but it is applications to the board. The local board is who reviews applications and then awards based on that.
Are we the local board, or is
We
it?
had one Washington County representative, but there was also representatives from Valley of the Sun United, not Valley of the Sun, sorry, United Way from Portland, not Phoenix.
Yeah, you
Multnomah
said that
County
was
person
United
and
Way,
Clackamas County
sorry.
person is who our local board is. It's for the Tri-County region.
Jess, question or?
I have a, can I ask a question?
Yes, Rachel, sorry. Yep.
Can the rent or mortgage payments, does that count towards our limit for permanent housing with this, like this? I know we have like a COC limit for how much we can spend on permanent housing. And does this count towards it?
No, separate funding source, not tied at all to continuum of care or HUD funding.
Because it just seems like that is the other way I would look at it, which is like, what is the flexibility of this money versus the flexibility of other money? And it's hard to make a decision about dividing up a pot of money without the context of all the other money. I don't really know how to do that. So
Yeah.
the other way to think about it for me is around flexibility. So like, you know, what are the other resources involved that could pay for some of these things, and what's more flexible? Like this seems like if we can use it for rent and it doesn't count, I don't know if it's we are able to do it in a way where it doesn't impact what we want to spend out of the COC, but maybe that's such a small part of what Washington County has and the rest is SHS that doesn't matter. So I would be really curious to know from the county staff who know the bigger picture more thoroughly than me, like where you guys think this makes the biggest impact based on the flexibility and kind of the other resources in the system. I'd be willing to accept your expertise on this because I have no idea, basically.
Yeah. And then same line thinking, Rachel, is our one-time funding that you brought up, Jess. What can that fund that's potentially on this list or not?
I mean, it will be able to, SHS funds everything on this list except mortgage payments, I think. Yeah.
So one-time funds would not do mortgage payments, could do eviction prevention, but okay.
And to Rachel's question, I mean, these are not funds we're administering, it's funds we're advising on what we see as priorities and so I agree, like, let's fill gaps that we can't fill with our resources. And you know, the amount of this funding compared to the resources from our county system, 200,000 compared to $140 million a year, so small that I think I think it's in some ways, yeah, I don't know what the right word is to say, but I think we welcome any of your recommendations.
I would also say in a lot of ways, this is a lot more restrictive than local funding, state funding. There's a lot of flexibility. This is a federal dollar. So at the end of the day, this probably won't be funding somebody who is undocumented. So I would say the least. Yeah, the least burdensome for the folks that are going to be administering this, the better, and the easier it is going to be for them to actually get money out the door, would be staff recommendation. Stacey?
Yeah, thanks. I think during the operation of the housing side of the programming, if people have been hitting against the mortgage, you know, people coming forward with mortgages and not being able to help them in any way, that did stand out to me when you said it could be rent or mortgage. I was like, oh, that's a pretty rare thing. So I'll just say that, like, it could be somehow complementary, but knowing that it's a federal dollar, then just whatever, like hard to imagine can use it best.
Zoe?
My last recommendation will be on reach. How many people can we reach with 200,000 paying mortgage or rent, and how many people can we feed with 200,000? How many children can we feed? How many meals can we provide in a shelter that provides hot meals? That will also, to me, be great point to consider.
Nothing more to discuss. Can I get a motion from somebody on the council to recommend a percentage to start with and what priorities? Maybe start with priorities and then assign a percentage.
I mean,
I motion to stay the same, 80-20. Yeah, you can discuss it. I second, somebody second.
I might go 50-50.
I maybe 80-20 where it was.
Where it was? Keep it where it was?
Yep.
Okay, so he seconded my motion.
Yes.
Without the words.
Now
Yeah.
you can discuss it.
Oh, Robert's rules coming in full effect.
Throwing it out there.
So I heard an 80-20, I heard a 50-50. The motion on the floor is 80-20 for 80% rent and mortgage, 20% food. Do y'all have anything to discuss? Do you want to further discuss, or would you like to take a vote?
We can take a vote.
Okay.
Okay. So, based on the vote that we need to provide, the proposal we've discussed is 80% towards rent mortgage assistance and 20% towards food. And then do I use Christina's as the, okay, and Bob seconded. So now we'll all vote. So all in favor, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. And did anyone have to abstain? Okay,
Well done.
consent agenda motion was passed.
Decision making.
Okay. Thank you so much, Katie. That was good information. Now I'm gonna hand it over to Jess to discuss the Regional Policy and Oversight Committee Regional Investment Fund priorities. And this is going to be part 1 of 2, because we'll end up having to continue this conversation in our next meetings. Jess, take it over.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen. This is a continuation of prioritization of resources, a theme of today's meeting. So as we get into this conversation, let me frame up what are these resources? What pots of money are we talking about here in the context? And then also as we go, if you can be folding these two questions in your mind, are there other regional strategies that you would want to prioritize for this resource? And are there things on this list that I'm going to describe that you actually think aren't the best use of these resources? So should we be prioritizing other things or should we be deprioritizing? It's the gist of the question that's coming your way. But let me lead in here with what is the Regional Investment Fund. So in the Supportive Housing Services measure that was approved by voters May of 2020 and that we've been implementing for the last 5.5 years or so, the section 23 described a tri-county plan and strategy for advancing regional efforts and coordination to improve upon the ways services are facilitated across county lines in the Portland metro area, so that we could better meet the need of our community. And actually, can we fold from this slide because I want to not get into the weeds just yet. So in that section 23 tri-county plan, there was also considered a requirement, or there was also made a requirement that county programs reserve at least 5% of our annual program revenues received through this measure for the purpose of investing in these regional solutions and regional strategies. In truth, the measure was not entirely descriptive. This was the last section of the measure. It was kind of the final term of the grand experiment of supportive housing services. And there was a lot that needed to be figured out in the coming year and 2 years. And that's part of why it took a while to get rolling. Is if you were around in those early days, there was no tri-county planning body for about a year, and then took about another year for these 6 strategies to be envisioned and documented and then approved. So now we are living in the aftermath of all of that work, but we're also living in a new era where governance has been reformed through supportive housing services. And what once was, and you all know this, I'm going to just be brief about it. What once was the Regional Oversight Committee and the Tri-County Planning Body is now one combined body that's called RPOT, which Zoe sits on as one of our members, as well as one of our commissioners. And that body is responsible for both the oversight of the measure and the continued work towards regional strategies and solutions that advance the overall cause of the supportive housing services measure. And their role will be directing the investment of these regional investment funds. Again, the funds are already held in the counties, but they're kind of like restricted funds. They have to be spent on these specific purposes. And so this is how we're spending them today. This is what's budgeted already. When we put forward the budget, you all were a part of that this spring. It included all of our programmatic investments and staffing costs and consultant costs and other kinds of smaller contracts that contribute to those regional strategies. So they are part of our Washington County work, but they are specifically our work because we're contributing towards these regional efforts. So it's not Kim, I'm trying to answer the question that staff passed along to me from you at the earlier briefing meeting. It's already improved in our budget. It's part of the whole pie.
Okay.
It's just that we have to make sure we're spending part of the pie towards these specific purposes. And who approves the purposes are that regional table. So they've been approved. We're required to make these kinds of investments. But that new table is going to be taking up this question of what should be prioritized and what should be deprioritized. And in order to have that conversation effectively, we want you all to have that conversation with us so that staff can be representing that work, so that we can be tapping you into those regional conversations. And for Zoe, who's going to be our voice at that table. So that's the nature of this part 1 conversation. Before I get into the specifics of the 6 strategies, any questions?
We do, from Rachel.
Yes.
Says, how are we working with the other counties on some of these strategies, like using the same outreach process and making the same commitments to landlords? I like all our RIF ideas. I just want to leverage any work that other counties are doing as well. I'm sorry, Rachel, I should have just had you unmute.
I just,
All good. You-
it's not really a question, so I didn't ask it. This is my idea. It's just a thought to think about. That's all.
It's a great question. It's an opportunity for me to offer clarification that all of the strategies are the same in each 3 counties. But what might be different is like, well, we have this program that works this way, and so it's a RIF investment in Washington County for 200,000, but in Clackamas County, it's called something else, and they actually are spending 300,000 on that RIF investment. But it's all 3 counties have the same regional strategy, which is let's figure out how to help landlords tap into the risk mitigation fund or something. That's kind of a bad example. I mean, I think
Okay.
risk mitigation fund is pretty much exact in all 3 counties, and that's one of these strategies. But let's talk, maybe there's landlord liaising capacities. And in one county that's outsourced by a third-party service provider, in another county that's a staff person on site. But it's serving the same strategy and the same intention across the 3 counties and with Metro. Rachel, you want to follow up? Any further thoughts there?
I have many thoughts. I'm not sure any of them are worth articulating at the moment.
Okay,
Thinking.
please keep thinking. We want this conversation to be juicy and complicated because it is juicy and complicated at the regional table. And frankly, I think we feel like we're a little bit like out there trying to figure it out on our own. And as much as we can hear from you all, what is important when we try to do regional work? How do we use these resources effectively? Does it make sense to be spending this much money on quote unquote regionalism when we're closing shelter beds? That was a conversation that came up at the last RPOC meeting. So, you know, kind of how you didn't answer exactly Katie's questions she put on the funding opportunity. It's important to hear the other context because it helps us strategize and navigate this conversation. So keep asking hard questions.
So we've been doing these strategies for 5 years?
No, it's like they've been, it took it took a year to start, get the committee adopted, and then it took a year for the committee to kind of get itself organized. And then I think they started adopting strategies like maybe one every 3 or 4 months. And they just finished adopting strategies, I think in November. So some of them are longer, older, and some of them are newer. And I think they actually go in order. The oldest one is landlord and the newest one is the employee retention and recruitment.
Thank you.
Yeah, but good question.
Are you gonna go through each of these?
Yes, I will,
Okay.
if you're ready, but do you want to ask any other hard, sticky questions? Because this is a good time.
Well, I just think it would be interesting. I just want to point out that it seems like some of the conversation at the committee was really, because I was listening in, was really about also like who gets to control the money. And so that's like this overlay of this conversation, which is not just about what are the strategies, but also about who's who gets to implement them. I just think we should be holding that in our head as we talk about it, because that is something that's been posted on, or put forward on the table.
I really appreciate you naming that, Rachel. We were actually surprised that was being named because we had understood that conversation was going to be held back for the next measure, but it sounds like that conversation is still in the mix. It may still be about the next measure and reforming the measure there. I don't know. Legally, the IGA and the measure says very explicitly these funds are in the county's hands. So how we get to a place where it goes back to Metro is a legal question that could not be changed until the measure, from my understanding. But I appreciate you naming that because it is something in the conversation for sure. My sentiment, but again, this is meant to be a sticky conversation, so please bring your thoughts, is that who controls the money should only be a conversation after we understand what are the resources best used for. And then we can better answer the administration of the resources. But it might not go down that way. And in fact, it's not going down that way right now. So thank you for naming that, Rachel.
I have a question about metrics, because some of the goals have metrics attached, some do not. Some of them, as you said, are pretty recent, some have been in place for longer. how carefully have those metrics been collected and tracked? Because I know the implementation is sort of ongoing and pretty recent.
Yeah.
So are there metrics that have been collected, I guess, in line with the goals to give us a sense of what's been working and what's not?
That's such an excellent question. I'm just gonna answer with, it depends. Every goal has happened at a different stage in the kind of life cycle of this, concept, this of regionalism and this table of tri-county planning body. And I think things got more and more clear and specific as they went along. So perhaps there's more data. Well, there's more metric measuring in the more recent measures, except there's less data because they're more recently in implementation. And some of the things are really qualitative to measure in any regard, even if you have metrics. Okay. For sake of time, I'm going to move through quickly, and then we're going to try to make sure we have time for some questions. But again, this is why we made this a part 1 of 2, because it is a juicy conversation, and we'll need to get back into it in August. So first, there is the landlord recruitment and retention goal. Right now, Washington County is investing, our required RIF investment is about $5 million, because it's about 5% of $100 million revenue for SHS. So our commitment in our budget is about 1.3 million. But what's kind of more important to take away is that resource is invested in a handful of things, primarily the risk mitigation fund, an important strategy for recruiting landlords to be our partners in housing harder to house households. This fund pays for damages that cannot be otherwise resolved for a landlord, and is implemented by HDC. Each county has a separate contract, but it's the same contract in all 3 counties with HDC. And there's an exciting effort to expand this program, not just to permanent supportive housing participants, but also rapid rehousing. So kind of expanding the ability to recruit landlords for those households too. There's also been some efforts to streamline the incentive tools, the way we work with landlords, how we educate communications. That work is mostly done. It's been done through staff work primarily over the years. This strategy has existed. And then there were 2 pilots in place, one in Multnomah County with Housing Connector and one in Clackamas County for landlord hotline. And those pilots are still ongoing and being evaluated for their effectiveness to be considered for expansion, if you will. I would say they both, my peers in the counties have both shared that they have found those pilots to be underwhelming. So that's landlord recruitment and retention. I'll keep going. So jot your questions down and I'll try to be quick. Another is creating regional consistencies in how we do coordinated entry. So we all know that we're going to all have to keep our own HMIS data and have our own coordination. It's part of being a continuum of care in each county. But how do we make those systems as consistent across the counties so that we're more familiar with one another, so that we're treating all of the participants in our system as similarly as possible to create that efficiency and equity across county lines. So we've had some key strategies. Most of this work is being done with staff and consulting coordination. And it's around how we call it phase 1 in Washington County is facilitated, how that all will roll over into the new HMIS work. The HMIS, as you all know, is being updated from WellSky to BitFocus. It's a whole transformation that ideally will make HMIS a more accessible platform for all of our users in the region. And then once you do the assessment and coordinated entry, obviously the matching to the services is the key outcome of that work. And so how are we creating regional consistency in the matching between the That's coordinated entry.
Just one
Yes.
question. I think I know the answer. This is the total budget they're showing us in these boxes and we get our 33% or whatever.
Yeah, it's really tricky to think about the risks. We already get the money.
Right.
It's in Washington County. In our budget of $100 million for SHS in 26-27, 700,000 and 716,000 is going towards this specific goal. So this is Washington County's investment in this goal. That is a
But-
Washington number.
And
Yes.
this also says that we're gonna have we're all gonna use the same HMIS platform.
Yes, well, Sky?
Yeah.
Yep. That the last goal did, yes. Yep, that is a part of that strategy. Part of the investment is that transformation into that new platform and the training, the consultants that are all helping make that happen. Kim, did you get that?
No,
That, the budget is Washington County.
just Washington, this is just
Yeah.
Washington County.
Yeah. It's about $15 million a year that is restricted regionally for regional investments because it's about a $300 million program. It's probably more than $15 million because it's more than 300 million.
Okay. But this is ours.
Yeah, we are just showing you our Washington County numbers.
Thanks.
Yeah. Healthcare integration. I would say that across the counties, this is the one that feels the most impactful. I mean, of course, coordinated entry and HMIS is just part of our work anyway. This is where we're seeing regional transformation happen. Adam, huge kudos to your team and the data sharing agreements. This is just unlocking doors we don't even know what are going to lead to yet, but it's very exciting and important work. And this goal, I would say, has been the impetus to drive a lot of that. Mindy Statlander, the CEO of HealthShare, sits at this table. Of course, HealthShare doesn't serve the entire region of Medicaid participants, but it's the largest provider. And so we're able to build from that work and expand to other open card or Trillium participants. But this has been transformative work. We're looking at medical respite is a big part of it. Cross-sector case conferencing, Washington County was a leader in that space, and that has become a regional best practice. And then the data sharing agreement, as I was describing.
There were 3 goals and I would say we actually completed 2 of them and out of the 3, with the third being really like having a lot of motion. So the 3 goals were expand options for people discharging from the hospital, which would include medical respite. The second was expanding cross-sector coordination, and that's where our cross-sector case conferencing comes in, of which we've now done 545 people regionally, and it is available to everyone who is not a HealthShare member. So
Thank you for that clarification.
yeah, and
That's amazing.
yeah, and then the third one was expanding the data sharing agreements, which are now in all 3 counties. So it's like I have heard a lot of feedback that the healthcare integration and alignment goals regionally are the ones that feels regional in how we're all doing them, and it's been a good. I will say it feels like a good use of the funding, and it's yeah. So
yeah,
I will stop there.
I don't think you're gonna find much argument to that. So don't worry, nothing sticky there. The one thing I'll say is the dollar amounts don't really equate to the value. And it's hard to do that because some things just cost very different than other things. Staffing, a dollar for dollar is really different than the cost of a risk mitigation fund, if you will. So in a way, I'm not sure that the budget box is that significant. It's like, are the purposes, are what we working on the right things to work on? And then we can go figure out what it's going to cost to get that job done.
Right, so how did we get to these budgets?
Basically, the strategies drove a budget. Like, what does it cost to do those things? How much staffing would it take to figure this out? How are we going to deliver these objectives?
Okay, so like the next one, huge budget.
Yeah, let's go there. Technical assistance. This was TA, there was a lot of value early on. Again, like this is a question of, are we where we were when we built these strategies around capacity building for community-based service providers? And the reason this budget is so big is Washington County put out a lot of one-time funding for capacity building. And we put that towards our RIF commitments for regional capacity building. So this is us finishing up that work. There are a couple providers who are still doing their technical assistance capacity building grants or spending down those dollars. And that's primary the budget that you see here.
When will they be done?
Oh, and I'm sorry,
It's okay.
I didn't speak fully. Also, the
Yeah.
quality assurance program is another major component, because that's a capacity that is funded ongoing. So the first item is one-time fund to your question, or one-time cost to your question, Kim. The second item in the bullet is an ongoing cost to our system, the quality assurance program, because that is technical assistance to
Yeah.
support data quality and across our system. Questions? I'm gonna keep going. There's just 2 more, and then you guys can come back to thoughts.
Yeah.
All right, training is very similar to technical assistance, except the strategies are really different. This is around primarily is focused on training the service provider staff of our system. So all of your case managers, for those of you who are representing community-based providers. And one of the primary objectives is around a PCC non-credit training program. I would say most of this budget is just the staff supporting that effort. I think so far any costs have been minimal and would grow through implementation of that future strategy if it moves forward. And then last, employee recruitment and retention. I will share that this was the hardest goal. It was the last goal to be adopted. It was probably the first goal to be voiced, because was a lot of value around supporting a strong workforce and paying that workforce well. But it was hard to identify policies that could be legally advanced to require minimum pay and all of that. And we already have pay equity in the state of Oregon. And so again, the budget does not reflect the value or the import of this goal, but so far that goal has been really focused on streamlining contract procedures to make it easier for providers to do work with counties and therefore easier for them to retain staff. And continuing to evaluate the wage and demographic survey. So this goal and the strategies, I think, perhaps, Zoe, jump in here if you want to add. The Tri-County Planning Body was concluding its work as it was trying to pass its final strategy. And this was maybe the best it could do with the time it was given on that strategy.
So this isn't a strategy we've in Washington County implemented?
Well, in many ways, the contracting strategies that have been identified are already implemented in Washington County. So they are practices that are trying to be advanced across the other counties. And we've been doing a wage and demographic survey since the very beginning of the program, and I think became a model for the other 2 counties. So no, we already are doing this. And we're using some staff capacity to support the regional effort of this.
So I need a little more, I'm not following tracking. So what does that look like on the ground? What are we doing? I mean, I understand what a survey is. We can do surveys all day long. Yes. That's what we've done.
And the county contracts around procedures for invoicing, what's it called when you get upfront pay and all of the advances. Thank you, Zoe. So county's strategy, trying to make contracting with the county as streamlined as possible across all 3 counties. So I wouldn't know, I'm not saying we're done with that, Kim. There's potentially still a lot of work to do.
I'm just not connecting that strategy with wages for direct service staff.
I think this is where the committee really struggled.
Okay, great.
I think sometimes if there was like a big delay in receiving payment, you had service providers are basically floating staff on their own, you know, out of pocket. And there's like a certain point where, but there's a point where that begins to threaten the ability to keep paying people if you can't get paid quickly.
Yeah, I think we are very much over that hump here in Washington County and doing an excellent job of invoicing and payment, not maybe 100%. Because we did live in that world as a service provider for just a little bit, but we've seen individually a shift in that. It's that specific wages to direct services that I want to lean into to direct service providers, just because what we see on the ground is staff still struggling, staff needing to get food boxes and staff having to look at rental assistance and staff getting evicted. And so, health insurance,
So what I'll offer here as we look at this final pie is that Washington County is investing at least 5% of our annual funds towards these regional strategies as required and contributing towards their advancement. And this is going to be a question. Are these the right strategies to be advancing? Are there better ways to direct these resources? And also, if we don't use these funds for these purposes, then where do they come from in the other 95% of Washington County's budget, or do they discontinue? So I just want to name that out loud as there's a push and pull here. We'll have to ask ourselves in Washington County, does this work continue for ourselves, if not at that regional table? All right, we have just a few minutes, but let's hear from thoughts from around the committee and anything that would be helpful for our next time we have this part 2 of this discussion.
The technical assistance, which is the largest of those chunks, you referred to the one as a one-time capacity grant and then the rest of it's sustaining.
Yes.
Are you looking at like doing more one-time grants in that area, or will that budget number go down?
Well, thank you for that question. We don't have any continued, after we finish out, about $1 million is in one time and a 1.2 I think is in the ongoing. After we finish out these capacity grants, we don't have plans to continue it. Though going forward after this fiscal year, after the pie you saw, all of our investments will have to be updated based on the direction of that regional RPOD table. So if they tell us put more money towards community, then we will put more money towards community. We might have to take more money out of something else. But this is why we're hoping to get your all input, because that conversation is coming at that regional table.
Okay.
I think for me, it'd be helpful to know, for the implementation plans that have metrics, are there any that you've had a chance to gather a little bit of data on, and what are they? And then also, like in terms of the goals or strategies in the plans, for the RIF, like which ones, like you're talking about contracting stuff, like which ones do you feel like you've met or made progress meeting? And we could therefore kind of like say, okay, well, maybe we don't need to prioritize those in Washington County. Maybe that shouldn't be a focus because we've already done that.
All right, so what's the staff opinion?
Yeah.
So much more work to do in health and housing, so much more
Yeah.
work. Training, the PCC pilot, this feels like a real regional value add if we could really do it and figure, I mean, that's not enough money to do it. We're not really doing it yet. The goal feels important. We'll have to find the budget to do it.
The goal feels important, but the non-credit training program, I can just see my staff being like, I'd rather, you know what I mean? If you're gonna invest in me, invest in something that actually adds value to my future. And I'm not saying the training doesn't add value. I'm just saying that they're gonna look at certifications and things that actually they walk away with something that in this case is credit.
Which benefits the workforce.
Great point.
So, yeah,
We'll get you on that
fear,
committee. And I think risk mitigation funds, we couldn't do this work without it.
Yeah.
There's probably more for us to be doing in landlord support, but the housing market and the affordable housing owner needs are so different from when we started this goal. We were really focused on finding landlords. Now we have landlords who are our partners who are looking for tenants. And so it's like we're in the upside down of what this goal was initially
That was
designed
my next
for.
question, is like, what does that match between the amount of rental assistance dollars available and the number of available landlords and units look like? And how do you want to calibrate that by recruiting accordingly?
And then coordinated entry, I think after this year, we will have seen largely that effort through. So there's a lot to do this year in the transformation to WellSky, but it might not need to be an ongoing funded effort, if you will. Those are some initial thoughts from staff, but I'll leave there.
But I mean, it's we're back to the tension. It's not enough to actually do all the things. Because really what I'm hearing, basic, is there's wiggle room from technical assistance because we're going to get rid of our one-time funding. You mentioned it's $1.1 million. Where do we filter that into these priorities that we feel are important? Healthcare comes up. I'm not pointing at you, sorry. You're the only one. landlord mitigation, we're gonna talk about living wage, but that's a very small amount of money to try to actually make any of them do what we want them to do. That's helpful, Jess, really just take that back and run with it. I gave you nothing.
So, like, I don't know if this does anything, but I mean, I try to look at it from what does any kind of change have to do with the mental health of the people and the clients and the peers that we're working with? Because as we've talked about, that the crossover between the houselessness and the mental health needs is there, but not always addressed. So as I guide or as I think about what changes you're going to make or what you're doing in even the Tri-County, how does any change affect the people that I work with? How does any one of these changes, taking it from does the technical do anything? Does it, money going somewhere? How does it affect the people with mental health? Got to speak for that.
I really appreciate that comment.
Stacy and then Rachel.
Yeah, thanks. I was thinking, so thanks for offering something that's kind of like a guiding principle when you were thinking about the mental health piece. I was thinking of the guiding principle of, is there anything that we know is coming in this next year or years in the near horizon that would be needed for this? And I was questioning, this is just a question because I'm not in it directly, is there an HMIS change that will move through this in a way that we'd want to dedicate more funding to something because everybody's on the same system and trying to do it more similarly or whatever, and because we don't have the 3 or 2 different systems that there used to be. So I'm just wondering if there's a timeliness that layers onto this decision of how much to spend in each area, or set aside, I guess is a better way to say it.
Really helpful point, Stacey, around our guiding principles. Thank you. North Stars. Rachel?
I actually can't remember. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I was going to say that last year or 2 years ago, Metro started doing a lot around training. And so I'm hoping while we do some of these, like if it felt really disconnected to have all the work that you guys had done to put training together, and then I was getting phone calls from Metro about what kind of training resources people need. And so I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, but just trying to make sure that we're not duplicating some of that effort with these regional strategies, that if the county is investing time and thought into a training product, that it's not, that somehow we're coordinating with our funding partner or whatever.
Thank you, Rachel. I really appreciate that up. I appreciate all of these comments, and I'm just going to go ahead and say something a bit risky because I said this was going to be sticky. I find it challenging to understand, I think many of us do, the purpose of this fund when we have county funds for the programming and the delivery of the service to the community. And we also have funds dedicated for Metro's administrative work and the county's administrative work. And these are additional resources. And it's a lot of money, $15-20 million a year is a lot of money regionally for system coordination. And so how do we keep ourselves, how do we minimize the bloating of staff or administrative, fiscal stewardship for all of the jurisdictions and maximize the dollars that impact the people, but also modernize our systems to better serve our community? And what are the resources needed for that modernization? And is this the right way or the too much or, so that's what we're struggling through. And I hope you all will continue struggling through with us next time.
Yeah, we'll have part 2. So sleep on this and then just make sure to make notes so you don't forget to ask questions next time. So, should we go ahead and look at adjournment or?
To you all, if we are over time, if folks have time to listen to Abel's.
Yeah, are you okay?
Or else
Singing for a few extra? Abel, do you want to give your everything you know update?
Sure. I'll try to make it as short and sweet as possible. currently at the end of the school year for pretty much all the districts in Washington County. And so for the year, just wanted to give you a quick final numbers. Ended the school year with approximately 2,700 individual students that we identified and served as McKinney-Vento. Well over 280 of those kids were unaccompanied youth. Throughout the year, we did see a huge increase in the severity of cases. And so families, I think I've talked about it before in past meetings, but families spending prolonged periods in vehicles or even in other situations like tents. We did also see an increase in families qualifying due to DV. And so we made a lot more referrals this year to both Street Outreach and the Family Peace Center in comparison to previous years. A lot of that we are guessing, more or less educated guessing, that it's due to the increase in ICE activity that happened specifically during the fall. We did have a lot more families actually verbally mention that some of the reasons why they were hesitant to participate in our program or be qualified for our program were because McKinney-Vento is a federal act, and so the federal component deterred them into wanting to receive services, not just from us, but any other resource that was deemed as federally funded. And so just wanted to get that out there. When there's outreach being done, just the type of language that's being used, and making sure that we reassure folks that we're here to support them and that we don't want to put them at risk for anything. As far as other updates, most of us McKinney-Vento liaisons in the county come back in middle or late August. There have been some changes, specifically with Beaverton School District, where they are, because of funding and budget cuts, they two current liaisons have been bumped, unfortunately, from their positions and are going to be replaced by other staff members. And so there's going to be a period of time where there's going to be just one actual liaison because those new people are going to be training into the position. And so just be on the lookout. We're probably going to need some more support on the education level and on the youth level from all of us as community partners. But yeah, try to make it as short as possible. Apologies for the late updates.
Thanks, Abel. Okay. I just need a motion to adjourn. And
So moved.
Second.
this meeting
Wait,
is
wait,
now
wait,
adjourned.
wait, before we
Oh, sorry.
can I say
Adjourned.
something? I want you guys to all have a chance to check our utility assistant program. I know sometimes I've been short to probably, let you guys know of what our utility assistant program does for our Washington County community. Right now, we're offering AC, portable AC to seniors in our community for free. We don't do installation, but we deliver it through Amazon. We are also probably, thankfully, to our legislation, we'll be probably getting a lot more funding, not only LIHEAP, but OEP, Oregon Emergency Program, Energy Program. And I'm going to start looking for partnership. I don't want to just increase my capacity within, but look for other systems of care where we can go and offer utility assistance and other utilities, not only electricity, but other other services that we offer payments and also discounts. So check it out. It's in there. Everything that we offered. Send it to your networks as well, and wait for probably my email and see how we can collaborate and promote this more broad to our community. Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Zoe.
Okay. Motion. Meeting's adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.